Thank you for listening in on our podcast in the series Intergenerational Conversations on Climate. The project is the product of Voices for Sustainable Environments and Communities as part of your province's Environmental Trust Fund at work. Climate crises appear in global and national news with increasing frequency and desperation. Voices of concern can be heard every day. Voices of hope are less common. How do our friends and neighbors think about the new climate? Let's find out. This episode truly brings together two generations in the form of father and son to discuss their concerns and explore hopes about climate change in our province. Today we have Dr. Bruce Langhus and his son John in what I'm sure will be a spirited discussion. I'm your moderator, Cameron Davidson. Good day, gentlemen.
Hello.
Good day.
Okay, now I want to start by having you introduce yourselves because, Bruce, this is usually your chair.
Correct.
You're usually the facilitator of these things, and I wanted to give the audience a little bit of a background in why you chose to do this series.
Very good. I am, by training and by employment, all of my professional life, I'm a geologist. And so largely I have been a petroleum geologist until I saw the light. And now I am an environmental geologist. And one of the things that I've become more concerned with as time goes on is the effect of the future effect and the current effect of climate change. And it's really dire effects on humanity. And so what I wanted to do was to increase the awareness and understanding of climate change among friends and neighbors. And so this is one of my first attempts at initiating conversation amongst people. And one of the things that I always was struck with was conversation ability and facility between people of different generations, and that how that power dynamic plays out. And I wanted to explore that as well as explore the feelings of both youth and senior citizens, because I think the climate disasters, climate catastrophes have a different effect on us as we age. And so that's what I wanted to do. That's what intergenerational conversations is meant to explore.
And John, did you follow in your father's footsteps?
Only kind of. I followed into the oil and gas business, much to his chagrin, but I went in as a lawyer rather than as a scientist. So I'm an energy lawyer, and I switched out of the oil and gas business about 9 years ago and moved into the solar energy industry from oil and gas. And I've been following climate change since I was in college. It's been a big issue for me for a long time as an activist and a community organizer. And when I went into the oil and gas business, that was when we were thinking that gas would be a great bridge to clean energy. And so that was part of my motivation for doing that.
Would you say that you followed in the family tradition so far as transitioning from one end to the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of at that point we were sort of walking closer to side by side. So, Dad and I have talked about these sort of issues, very, very in depth, very intimately for 30 years now, basically since I went to college, and I'd have weekly phone calls letting him know what I was thinking about, what my classes were doing, and probably started those conversations way back then.
Now, in your opinion, is the global climate in crisis?
Absolutely. I think the climate has been in crisis for for 30 years already. I find it increasingly alarming, the lack of attention that it gets in government and policy, and with each year we go without doing much about it, it becomes that much harder when we finally decide we're going to.
Bruce, is the global climate in crisis?
Certainly, certainly. And as John said, it has been a long time coming. And if you look hard enough, it's coming to New Brunswick right now. There are certainly indications that changes are happening. I've looked at quite a lot of government temperature data of the areas in western New Brunswick. I think there are about 9 temperature and precipitation gauges in the area that have almost 100 years of data, and it's pretty clear that we've gained about 2.5 degrees in centigrade in the summers, and more than that in the winters. In the last 100 years, certainly, but the biggest changes have been in the last 40 years or so. And it doesn't really matter where you look. There are stark changes. I've done a lot of work in the western U.S. as a environmental regulator, and it just struck me one day starkly that the Great Plains, a naturally dry area, have really gone into a extra dry period since 1999. It was some people call it a hinge, some people call it just a tipping point.
Mm-hmm.
And 1999 around the world is remarked upon as a time of significant change. And in Montana and Wyoming, out to the west, the change has been very profound in that, except in the high mountains, there is no snow melt in the area. That means that there's the snow that gathers on the plains and in the hills. It evaporates in the spring. It doesn't make its way into the creeks and rivers, and so things are definitely changing. The parts that I was looking at, which I don't know how. It was about a third of each state, Wyoming and Montana. The only water that makes it into the streams are the summer rainstorms. And of course, as you can imagine, these are pretty few and far between. So, yes, we are in a crisis. Luckily, here in New Brunswick, we don't have scores of people dying from heat or savage rainstorms, but it's still it's here.
John, you were nodding your head in agreement, and you voiced your agreement in a couple of cases. So how important are accurate data to your understanding of climate crises, and whose data do you trust?
I think it's very important, though. I think that at this point in our history, the data points are sometimes less important than the stories, and getting people to understand that this is real and that this is affecting them as well as other people. So I was nodding a lot with some of those stories about New Brunswick. I'm up visiting from Vermont, down in the States. And, for us, you don't have to be a climate scientist. You look outside and you see, maybe you're a cross-country skier, and you know that the number of days that you've had to be out skiing on the trails is a fraction of what it was when you were a kid growing up. Those are real. Those are real experiences. The fact that all of New England basically is in a drought, in a part of the year, in a part of the country that really has never been drought prone. in the past, and I think it's maybe 3 out of the last 6 years that we've been way below normal. Parts of the region in drought. As far as sources, um, I certainly rely on books by people that I trust because of who has recommended them, or that sort of thing. I trust government agencies as opposed to necessarily elected government officials, though I certainly trust some government officials as well. But we're very lucky in the United States that we have a very robust science organization within government that puts out great information, frequently not acted upon by the people who are elected to consider that data, but really high quality stuff.
Okay, now you mentioned that you don't have to be a climate scientist to notice these things, but does a non-climate scientist have the right to express an opinion on climate?
I certainly think so. I mean, our lives are so incredibly complicated, right? The number of things that you do in your daily life that you actually have firsthand knowledge of how they work, right? That we trust is, I've got to think below 1% of the things that we do, right? I drive my car every day. I don't really know how my car is put together in sort of like I couldn't build a car. I know some basic stuff. I fly on a plane. I know even less about that. And certainly when I go to my doctor, I trust my doctor to give me advice about things that I certainly don't know about either. And even if you're a climate scientist, right, or even if you're some other sort of, even if you're a geologist, your specialty is so narrow compared to the broad body of knowledge. I think all the time we're always making decisions on whether to trust something that we're told by someone, and we're having to evaluate whether we trust that source sort of all the time. And I don't think that's any different in climate. I think it's an excuse for people to not take a stand on it when they say, and it's usually an elected official, right? I couldn't possibly express a view that because I'm not a scientist.
Doctor, does a non-climate scientist have the right to express an opinion on climate?
I'd have to give that a qualified yes. I have run into both sides of that question. Some scientists, some climate people actually, surprised me that by saying that no, a non-climate scientist doesn't have the right to an opinion, a public opinion. And I'm not sure what's meant by that. If they mean that they can't go on the CBC and talk about climate change, or if they mean they can't publish an article about it. I'm not exactly sure what they mean, but it's that's not my view at all. If like John was saying, if somebody notices that the snow on the trails where they're from, the snow is so meager it doesn't cover up the rocks anymore, that's a valid piece of information, even though it's not measured in tenths of centimeters. It's a valid piece of information and well worth considering. Now, on the other hand, I've also run into people who are constantly spouting factoids, saying, the hottest year ever in say in New Brunswick was in 1935, and since then it's been cooling. And so I always say to them, show me your data. Where do you get your data? And I said, everybody knows that. Well, that's of course a tip-off for saying that nobody has heard of that before. And in some cases, such as the 1935 heat wave, it's one day, and it was just in a very few locations in New Brunswick that this happened. and it's just one of those stray facts that are real, but when you put them in the context with a lot of other data, you see that it's meaningless and it doesn't correspond to anything, and it's difficult to say just what it was, but probably a very short-lived atmospheric meteorological situation that occurred this one day. So yeah, there are people who have the right to an opinion, but I frequently ask them to back it up with some data, to tell me what their data is and to show it to me and show me the long range effect that they're talking about. A few years ago, somebody was spouting that in the last 20 years we've cooled by some number of degrees in North America, but it's certainly not backed up by the data by any means. So
it's kind of interesting, right? Because we're almost there's a distinction, right? There's the question of can lay people validly express opinions about climate, and then there's the great saying that everyone's entitled to their own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts, right?
right,
Which is sort of more
exactly.
where you're going. And yeah, you hear the folks saying, "Oh, well, it's sunspots. Everybody knows it's sunspots, and it's part of the natural variability." And in the States, the version of the story you were talking about is, I think, 1933. It's either 1933 or 1934 that was the hottest year in the United States forever. And then it's no longer anymore, but it was always referred back to as, oh, well, no, clearly it's not climate change because there was this crazy hot year in the 30s. Of course, now the data has now gone past that. So, but I think it's still one of the 20. So I
Oh
think
yeah,
the 10
yeah.
of the 10 are now the last 10 years, and 19 of the 20 are the last 20 years with this one outlier. But it is tricky, that distinction between the facts and the opinions.
So those people that are spouting off these, we won't call them inaccuracies, but confused opinions, are they the ones, the laymen like me who don't know the first thing about this, are they confusing the words weather with climate?
Certainly, certainly, and that's one of the basics of the argument here that we're looking for is just what is weather and what is climate, and so the common saying is weather is what's outside my door, and climate is what's outside your door. That's the climate is the crap that you're seeing. So that's obviously wrong. But climate is the long-term expression of day-to-day weather, and whatever long-term means is certainly open to discussion. But it's a multi-year situation, and one likes to see the trends, not so much the data themselves, because the data themselves are really very complex and very difficult to explain in their entirety. But the data is there. Unfortunately, for most of Eastern Canada anyway, the data is in hour or half-hour intervals. And so what do you do with that? And so there's a number of ways that you can look at it. Just looking at the daily highs and the daily lows, you can look at the daily averages. And there are all kinds of things within that to best show the trend that you've identified. So there's lots of data. Climate can be defined as the temperature trends in the last 100 years. That means, of course, that that most of us are unaware of those things. As we all know, it's almost impossible to remember what the weather was like a year ago. And you tend to think, wasn't that the big drought last year? No, that was a really wet year. Well, I don't know.
So,
So
what's the most effective way to discuss climate with the uninitiated?
I think there's a number of ways. Of course, there's certainly the data, and it can show, for instance, that in the first half of the 20th century, winters were dominated by lows that were very close to or below 30 minus 30 degrees Celsius. Well, we haven't had a minus 30 evening in years. And now we're looking at the absolute minimum throughout the year, throughout the winter, of minus 21. And so that's a 10 or 12 degree difference. It's something that's very definitely real. But there's those kinds of numbers. There are the effects, the general effects on plants and animals within the area. I've been talking to apple growers around the area, and we're seeing very definite effects with the apples in the last 10 years. And so does that mean the handwriting's on the wall and we need to switch to pineapples to grow? I don't know. But there's something there that's going to become more clear and more manifest in the next 10 years. We can certainly go that way. We can stick mainly to economics, looking at the cost of disasters for the country of Canada, and we see that they're huge and getting larger every year. And so that's going to have an effect on the national economy and on the economy of you and I. And so there's that to look at. So there's a bunch of ways of looking at this that can bring this home.
John, have you found an effective way to discuss climate with people like me?
So I sort of actually come back to where we started with the first conversation. So with all due respect to the scientists, with a crisis like this, if we have to wait to take meaningful collective action until everybody is a climate scientist, right? We're gonna not do it. And that really includes even pretty basic data analysis, right? Everyone's just busy, right? Everyone has trouble reviewing their kids' homework in time, right? With everything else that they've got going on at night. The idea that they're going to sit down and they're going to pour through some science data, if they're not just a person that likes doing that anyway, is, I think, unrealistic. So from my perspective, I think what is important is helping people to be more critical in their consumption of information. Benefit of that is that it's not just relevant to climate, it's relevant to every single problem that we face in society, right? And so when you're talking to folks, talking to them about, don't take my word for this, right? Think about who I am and why I'm telling you this, and I'm going to explain my perspective on that. And then you evaluate for yourself whether you find me to be a critical source of information. If you've read some blurb in the Wall Street Journal's editorial page about how climate is in a crisis, and look at who sponsored that page in the Wall Street Journal. Is it the American Petroleum Institute? Okay, well, they've got scientists that work for them, but they also have a powerfully vested interest in getting you not to believe this. There's a great story that we were talking about today in a book by one of the leading climate scientists, Michael Mann, down in the States. And he tells this story about, they maybe didn't have this TV ad in Canada. But when I was a kid in the 70s, there was this commercial where it's this broad, magnificent landscape in the western United States, and there's a single Native American on his full headdress and everything sitting on a horse, and he's looking out over this, and the entire landscape is polluted with garbage. And then it goes close up onto this guy, and a single tear runs down his cheek, and it's a message of don't litter, right? It's one of the most powerful commercials you're ever going to see. People my age, we saw this sort of Saturday morning cartoons. Everyone my age remembers this commercial. I would guess everyone my father's age that, saw it on their shows. Turns out that commercial was funded by the plastic beverage container industry. And so it was the time when redeemable bottle campaigns were starting in the United States, where people were saying, we need to put a 10 cents deposit on this so that people actually take these back and get them thrown away properly, at least, or if not recycled. And they were pushing back on that. And their strategy was to say, this isn't our fault. This is your fault for throwing it away. We're just making you a bottle of Coke, and that's what everybody wants, right? Is a nice convenient bottle of Coke. And so you see that exact same thing in the climate debates, where polluting industries, started with BP, want people to think about their personal carbon footprint, right? It's not our problem. We're just making the oil that you want to use. The real problem is your problem that, you're driving all around all the time and you want a big SUV, right? Well, the problem with that is it makes everyone feel helpless, right? How much can I personally do to mitigate this versus how much can we collectively do through our elected representatives, through organizing in the streets, stuff like that. So from my perspective, it's about sharing your stories with people that you're familiar with, because they're going to naturally be more inclined to trust you because they've gotten to know you, and explain to them what was convincing to you, and then encouraging them to be critical about how they consume information.
Now, when you mention the word critical, everybody and their brother nowadays thinks that critical thinking is just question everything. And the nut jobs on YouTube are the only ones who know what's going on because they did the deep digging, and they're the ones that know that the guy from BP, blah, blah, blah. So he's the one that's the real truth and everyone else is lying. What do you say to those people?
It's tough, right? It's the negative side of the information revolution. Right? Everyone is able to have a voice now. And so everyone is able to have a voice now. And yeah, it's become much harder to make a judgment call about sources of information, for sure. And, I think one of the most powerful things is if you can get yourself in the habit of, this person just said something that feeds into what I already think, right? So, did I get this on my YouTube feed because someone wanted me to see that, because it reinforces something that I believe? Or did I happen to stumble upon this? And right, so just think about, is this, and certainly there's some independent journalism that happens where people like that come up with stuff. But there's also a lot of really great information that's pretty established sources, that you can find stuff to back it up or not.
Now, Bruce, your son has mentioned a couple times now about elected officials, and it makes me wonder, it's a question that you've asked other people. So I'm going to ask you now, have you ever talked to, emailed, written to, or whatever with a political office holder about climate?
I have. In quite a number of different contexts. And yes, I've spoken to MLAs, I've spoken to members of parliament, and a mayor or two about this. And yes, sometimes it's a rewarding exercise. Sometimes it's just a bowl of frustration. And so, but I have to think that that being there in person in my own ugly, cranky way, I can make myself heard, and I can make these people at least consider my opinion when they're doing something or other, and calling some of their facts into question and giving them new facts that have real credibility. I hope that makes a difference, and I think all things considered, it does. And so I feel like I've had a positive effect on various political office holders. I think it's I think it's certainly possible for private citizens to make themselves heard.
But John, you say that sometimes or quite often this sort of thing, when you're discussing it with elected officials, fall on deaf ears.
For sure, when you're discussing it with anybody. But I absolutely 100% agree with what Bruce just said. So I've been an elected official for my sins down in small town Vermont. I was on my town council. There we had a program. We were trying to ban single-use plastic bags in the town, and there was fairly well organized opposition to that. And the way that we organized the meeting was that the fifth grade class at our elementary school, their community thing is the fifth graders are always in charge of the recycling for the school every year. And so we invited a group of the fifth graders from our town to our town meeting, and they did an hour-long presentation on plastics pollution and on the effectiveness of single bag bans. They had contacted officials in towns and other parts of the country that had already done them, talked about how they implemented them. They had done a survey of every business in our town to ask them, would this be a burden on your business if you could no longer do this? And it was remarkably persuasive. It was impressive that these kids had devoted so much time and effort to it, which was obvious. And they had they had some data. They had stuff to back up what they were saying. And that was super effective. And then in my own life, in the last 30 years as an adult, I've been a donor to political campaigns in the United States. I've volunteered on campaigns, both at the state level, congressional level. I've helped presidential campaigns. I live in Vermont, so I've met Bernie Sanders a few times to talk to him about solar policy, and these elected officials, they're very data driven themselves these days about representation issues. And so if you talk to their staff, you'll find that an email thing that gets sent to them, like a forwarded petition or something, that gets very little attention. A stamped letter that comes in, that gets considerably more attention. A handwritten letter gets more attention. A phone call, I think a phone call probably comes in between those type of letters, and a visit gets a ton of attention. And it gets attention on that personal basis. You get that feeling that you've really played a part in the process, but they see you also as a multiple, right? They know that if you bothered to drive up and talk to them that day, there are 10,000 people maybe in their election area that feel the same way. They're just not willing to drive up and talk to you. And so they have these multipliers. So if you can deepen your involvement, deepen your engagement, it really does have, I think, a very powerful effect the deeper you go.
Bruce, John mentioned the fifth graders and how they had an effect. How effective are schools at encouraging climate conversation?
It's I wish I knew. I wish I had more information about schools to say one way or the other. But unfortunately, I have only a few instances contact with schools. And so, for instance, in Gagetown, we have a grade school teacher who is incredibly driven to certain environmental tasks. One of them being composting, another being worm farming, and also trash pickup and recycling, that kind of thing. And so she exposes all of her, I think they're first graders. She exposes them into this world and some of these actions. So they think about those things, and I'm sure they go home and say, "Dad, don't throw that can away. Put that in the recycling." And so it's certainly a thing, and it certainly is reinforcing these ideas of the use of the environment. There are high school teachers who are awfully good at it. Some of the students that we've had in our intergenerational conversations have spoken highly of their teachers, and I'm sure that will that'll stay with them for a long time about how their teachers feel about things like zero carbon and various forms of pollution, things like that. And yet, I also hear from the students and from really lots of students that I run into that there are no classes in what we used to call citizenship, or the job of a citizen, the job of a voter. What are they supposed to do? And the things that we've been talking about here this afternoon, that certainly falls into it. How do we sort out the charlatans from the people who have real knowledge? How do we do that? And it depends. It's independent, really, of what you're talking about. Could be buying a car, could be recycling, or cutting back on your carbon footprint. You have a duty as a citizen to figure out what where the truth lies, or at least where the data lie. And so that's and that needs to be passed on to students, and it needs to be drilled into them that this is something that they need to do. And it also needs to be expressed to them that they have the ability to make themselves heard to politicians.
You mentioned that the students are a bit more engaged than people would really think they were. So, who are under the most threat from climate disasters? Is it the students or rather the adults?
Oh, it's definitely the students, because with them, it's a matter of survival. The old saw is that I'm going to die of old age, but my grandkids are going to die of of climate issues. That's most certainly true, and those of us in my age cohort will mostly be lucky enough that we'll die in our sleep, hopefully with some pleasant dream running through our head. We won't be dying in a forest fire. We won't be dying in a flood, or a huge Category 6 hurricane that's just battering down the forest and the trees around us. So, no, it's the youth who have they have the money in the pot. They have the horse in the race, and they're riding it. And if that horse stumbles, that's what's going to happen. So they need to be, and I think they are. They're aware of this, that this is their This is their task. This is their job to win it. And I wish them the best of luck, and I'll try to help them any way I can.
Do you think the students have more at stake than the adults?
For sure. I think it's almost like an actuarial table in an insurance calculator, right? The younger you are, the more you've got at stake here. And so the people with the most at stake have the least voice, right? The people who have the most at stake are people that haven't been born yet, actually. They have no voice at all. Children have next to no voice. And young adults, at least in the States, I think it's probably true in Canada as well, have pretty close to no voice because even though they can vote, they vote less than any other cohort, right? So I find that to be that's one of the things I get frustrated about. In my experience, kids on average are considerably more better informed about climate issues than the average person at a different age. So they do seem to be learning quite a bit about it, and they're certainly concerned about it. But it isn't translating that into more action, more political action from them. So personally, with election cycles now, I devote all of my attention to how can I help to get more young people voting, right? And that's sort of, to me at this point, the single biggest effect you can have is, taking 5 kids to vote on voting day.
So why aren't the students not out on the streets every day, John?
I wonder that question. So I think a lot of the super engaged ones are actually remarkably mature for their age, and they've made the decision that that's going to be less effective. You have the Sunrise Movement in the United States. It's run by, there may be some people over 30 now, but it was run all by people under 30. Remarkably successful, very deliberate about what they do and what they push for. They were very instrumental behind the New Green Deal in the United States, which is a big political movement coming in 2018. But they were realistic about it, and so when compromises had to be made and things got into the legislation that they didn't like, they didn't throw a temper tantrum. They said, that's fine. We understand. We want to be at the table. We want to be part of that discussion of that give and take, and we want it to be a good piece of legislation at the end of the year. At the end of the day, we know it's not going to have everything we want, but we want it to move forward, and that's something really that is I think new. Certainly nothing. There was nothing comparable in my cohort when we were in our 20s.
Are you sure about that? Because I do seem to recall. Now, I may have a few years on you, but there was a Rock the Vote campaign back in the day to try and get young people out there.
True, but it wasn't run by young people. But yes, there were some things like that. Those were sort of boomers trying to get X-Gen kids registered to vote. It was a great thing, and it definitely helped. There was a step change in that period of time on the number of percentage of people registered to vote in the United States. But these grassroots youth-led, with my cohort, what seemed to happen much more was sort of individual volunteering and things that people cared about. So a lot of that in my generation where people picked the thing that was going to be their thing and sort of like, just knuckling down and doing volunteer at a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter or something like that. But not these collective action sort of big movement sort of things that we're seeing now.
Bruce, in your travels, as you've been interviewing these younger people for intergenerational conversations on climate, do you find that they are more proactive with getting out there onto the streets and actually having their voice heard?
I see that they're more that they want more to have their voice heard. They're less inclined to toward activism, but they certainly see the power of their numbers and the fact that they need to talk about climate issues. They're really a remarkably well-versed and well-spoken people, and it will be to our loss if we don't help them to make themselves heard, very definitely. And I would like to see, but I'm from a different world. Back then, in between the eruptions of the volcanoes and the dinosaurs and whatnot, we did have a very powerful development with civil rights. And it was it covered an awful lot of the culture. It was not only the poor people in the urban centers, but it was also the suburban white churches were involved. And so it covered a lot of bases, and it certainly, I had just started college at the time, and so I got swept up in that thing of marching into Minneapolis or St. Paul to the federal courthouse, carrying a sign and whatnot. I don't know how much of that was due to the fact that a couple of girlfriends were involved in that. As well as I was, but it didn't really matter. I saw the issues there, what needed to be done, and I wanted to be heard also.
Now, the big question I have, and I think that this kind of sort of leads naturally into the next point, is we see the regression going on, especially down in the United States right now in certain laws that are being repealed. Does that give the younger people the impression that going out and taking to the streets is probably a fruitless endeavor?
It's unfortunate seeing the regression, as you say, of our civil rights in some aspects of society, and I'm not sure how this strikes the young. To me, it looks like I would just as soon say the only thing that's going to make a difference is by getting out there in the streets, and I don't want to say throwing a few bricks around, but come what may. And I think that this has to be part of the toolkit among activists. That there are times in which somebody has to get out on the streets. There's a book that actually John recommended to me a few years ago called Climate World, Climate Church, and it was written by an old hippie just like me who was had cut his teeth in the civil rights movement, and he has a great many things to say about how this formed him as a political being and also as a minister, a church minister. Now, maybe that's the same thing, being a politician and being a minister. I'm not sure, but it obviously has transformed his life and has put him on a certain trajectory there. And I think I would certainly say that the climate movement is the civil rights movement of the day.
Would you agree that this is the time now for the younger generation to be galvanized to go out there as opposed to giving up hope, John?
For sure. And I think we may be seeing that. So one of the big events of this year has been the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, the right to an abortion in the United States. Since that period of time, there have been 4 special elections, federal elections in the United States. In all 4 of those, Democrats have outperformed what you would expect their vote to be, suggesting that there's a lot more excitement behind those voters, that their turnout is better, more of them are voting. So, and if that's the issue driving them, then that's likely to be disproportionately women, but it's also disproportionately young, is the expectation. So we're going to see that this fall. So this fall, the expectation would be that Republicans would take over both houses of the U.S. Congress, just because that's what tends to happen in between presidential elections, is the other party makes up ground. So if they're able to slow that, it will be because young people have gotten galvanized and are going out in bigger numbers.
For the most part, where America goes, so does Canada. So oftentimes we take our political cues from our neighbors to the south, and hopefully if the younger generation does have that initiative to go out there and be heard and to make themselves known, then we have a hope here in New Brunswick as well. Hopefully there's going to be some sort of revival of the hippie movement, if you will. But in the meantime, all we have is money and influence. And as such, if Elon Musk called you and offered to top up your fund for 2 years to tackle one global aspect of climate crises, what would you take on, Bruce?
It'd have to involve education. And I'm not sure just how that would happen, but that's got to be the big push, is educating people on the dire need for action, and how best to do your own personal action. Like I say, does it involve getting onto the street, or does it involve going door to door? Does it involve going to the Capitol and knocking on MLA doors and telling them what you think, and how this is an extremely important date in the upcoming history of New Brunswick? Or maybe it's more of a global thing that needs to happen. I have to look at one of my heroes, Greta Thunberg, and what she's done in the last 4 years, and as a young teenager, and it's truly remarkable the effect that she's had. She wasn't depending upon Elon Musk's billions. It was simply her own small voice, and making it heard in what's very likely an extremely civilized part of the world, in Sweden. But certainly we live in an extremely civilized part of the world too, and so one individual can have a voice here in New Brunswick. Certainly, they can have a very clear voice in a state like Vermont, and certainly in a state like Texas or Oklahoma. There can be ways to make yourself heard.
So, same question to you, John. Now that Elon Musk isn't going to buy Twitter, he's going to throw all the funds your way. What are you going to do if you had like one global aspect of climate crises to take care of? What would you take on?
I think that I would definitely use that for organizing direct action by young people. So in sort of a mentoring way, letting them be the leaders, but there are certainly certain things that are useful to do in support as older folks, and so providing ideas, providing money, providing time, things like that are often short when you're young and you're just sort of trying to make it early in your life, and just help them what they need to do, help them organize actions, help them organize getting out to vote campaigns for whatever communities are getting ready for elections in their various countries, organizing lawyers to bail kids out of jail when they've gotten arrested at some protest, right? Giving people rides to protests or whatever. If you've got, some young people, if you've got some high school kids that want to go down and go to something and they need an adult to give them a ride down there, that's the sort of thing I'd do.
Excellent. Great. Well, this has been quite the conversation. It's been most pleasant. But thank you very much to Bruce and John for joining us in this episode. And I do believe this is the last of the season.
Well, it's the last of the series. Once school starts up again, we go back on the road.
Okay. Well, I do like being on the road. So cheers. Thank you very much. My name is Cameron Davidson, and I will be behind the microphone next time. And Bruce will be your facilitator once again. Until then, thank you very much for joining us in this episode of the podcast.